Hello and welcome to Hindsight in 2020, which is a series of videos coming to you from the Imperial War Museum. And I'm Mark Urban. I'm one of the museum trustees. Now, the aim of this series is to look at things that are happening right now, and that might be topics from US-China relations to hybrid warfare, information warfare, and that kind of thing, and look at them through the lens of history and see what we can learn by applying the lessons of history to those current situations. And of course, we're kicking off with our first video with the really big topic of the moment, which is coronavirus, COVID-19, call it what you will, the virus, the pandemic, the thing that has dominated our lives in so many countries around the world for the past months. And to do that, I'm joined by two excellent panelists. Professor Margaret MacMillan, both Toronto and Oxford universities, author of a whole series of magisterial histories, 1919, Nixon and Mao, also has looked in great detail at the peace that ended World War II. He's a fellow trustee of the Imperial War Museum and a Reith lecturer. Welcome, Margaret. We're also joined by Philip Collins, who was a speechwriter for Tony Blair, also an author. When they go low, we go high among his books, a columnist for the Times. And Philip, your favourite columns for me are when you deconstruct speeches and pull out the language and start to analyse the language. And that, I suppose, is where we should start, which is looking at the way that this coronavirus pandemic has been talked about in the public space, and whether the metaphors about war are really the right way to discuss the pandemic. Is it a great big battle? Is it a struggle? Is it a conflict? Are those in the hospitals and care homes, the front line, etc., etc.? You've all heard the language. I'm sure you'll understand what I'm getting at. So, Margaret, maybe you'd like to lead off. Do you think that sort of metaphor is appropriate, and what are its pros and cons?
Well, we've used the metaphor of war, I think, a lot in peacetime. We talk about wars on poverty, wars on racism, wars on obesity, and it's a language which I think has something useful, that it suggests that we're all in it together and we need to come together for a common cause. I find it a bit overused at the moment. A war is something very specific. It's organized violence intended to carry out your own aims or prevent your enemy from carrying out his aims. And the thing about war is that you actually have an end to it. You have a victory. And I suppose what is good about using the metaphor in the current situation is that we do need to work together if we're to deal with this pandemic. And we do need to use all the resources of society, which is what you do when you have a war. But I think it gives people the false impression that one day there's going to be a victory. We're going to say, oh, it's all over, it's all done, it's finished. And that's where I think it's misleading. And I also find the use by certain strong leaders, strong men mainly, when they talk about being war presidents or war leaders, seems to me often a cover for something else they want to do, and that is further their own interests and those of their particular regime. So I have mixed feelings about the metaphor, quite frankly.
Philip, is it a sort of political no-brainer, do you think, for Boris Johnson to adopt this type of language, and what are the possible pitfalls?
Yeah, it's very tempting for him, particularly as someone who's obsessed with Winston Churchill and sees himself as standing in that tradition. It was inevitable he'd pick up the metaphors of war. I very much agree with what Margaret says about it. I have mixed feelings about it too. I can see the temptation from a rhetorical and political point of view, and it does have some good implications, the bringing people together, the collective effort. But it's also an inappropriate metaphor in the ways that Margaret said, and also in the sense that a real war is fought against a visible enemy, whereas this is an invisible. The word enemy isn't quite correct. It's an invisible agency. It's a thing, something which we can't see. And so the sense of with war metaphors, when you're trying to conjure up the sentiment of the nation against some other nation, there's always that divisive sense in war rhetoric. It's not really appropriate when we're talking about an invisible entity like a virus. So it doesn't quite carry, it doesn't quite work as a metaphor, but I can see the temptations of it politically, which are very acute. And it's not just Boris Johnson. President Macron said, we are at war. And he said that very explicitly. He didn't even specify who we're at war with. So it's something we're all going to do. But I worry too about the temptations of less liberal regimes to use the sense of being at war, like we've seen in Hungary, to then, under cover of this apparent war, to do things which are really very dangerous and authoritarian.
I suppose even in more liberal democracies, as you say, the temptation is very hard to resist, because it allows leaders to imply that the normal rules of politics can be suspended, and the normal type of criticism they might face can be paused, if you like. But of course, if you're really a war president or a war prime minister, you have a government of national unity, don't you? You bring in the opposition, and that's how you achieve national consensus. Either of you, please come in.
Well, that certainly was the case in the Second World War. And there were some brief suggestions that might happen this time around, but it's very, very unlikely. But yes, it does. I mean, the idea of war justifies all sorts of extraordinary interventions. I mean, look at the interventions in the economy, for example, which have been necessary, but which echo some of the war economy of the Second World War. And it's particularly interesting, I think, with respect to the Labour Party, which I've always regarded as a bit of a war party. The Labour Party came to existence out of the First World War, and then it really acquired its ideological sustenance in the Second World War, because the measures that were taken, which were extraordinary measures during the Second World War, have always been thought of within certain Labour circles as being the norm. That's what it should be like. You know, the extensive use of the state is in fact the right thing to do. And the Labour Party has taken a long time to get used to the fact that these are extraordinary events. This is not the usual way of doing things. And we've now got a Conservative government which is doing an extensive economic intervention, which will have to unravel as we come out of this crisis. And that's going to be an incredibly difficult thing for them to do.
Yeah, I agree with Philip Collins that in wartime, governments take controls over societies, and we are prepared, I think, as citizens to give up individual liberties such as the right to move jobs, to eat what we want, go where we want, because we know it's in the name of a greater good. And I think that is what's been happening a bit with the pandemic, and I think we all accept that it's necessary. Where it becomes dangerous is where government uses the excuse of a wartime situation to perpetuate its control over society. And you're seeing it. I think Philip Collins mentioned Hungary. I mean, Viktor Orban has given himself emergency powers to rule by decree, and is being very vague about when he's going to end that particular period. And I think what is also dangerous about the use of the wartime metaphor is that it is quite right that the enemy we're fighting here is invisible and it's all around us, or may be here, may be there, but we're tending to look for enemies. I mean, you see it in certain circles in the United States, including, of course, in the White House, of calling it the Wuhan virus and trying to blame the Chinese for it. And we're seeing similar things in India, where the Modi government is blaming Muslims for carrying it. So I think the dangers, I think, are very real. What I do think, if we're going to talk about a war, what I would like to see is what we have done in wars in the past, and Britain has done it very successfully in 2 world wars, and that is actually use the resources of society as efficiently as possible and bring in the best brains. I think one of the areas the British government and other governments have fallen down is actually not doing that, not using resources effectively, not bringing in people who help organize them. I mean, I think the very evident problems with supply chains, for example, the things that in a war would perhaps have been dealt with more successfully in countries that could do this.
Philip, they do seem to there does seem to be a tension, doesn't there, between trying to reap the political benefits of war rhetoric, and then, as Margaret was suggesting, effectively mobilizing society when you have such strong centralizing, or dare one use the phrase, control freak tendencies in the messaging and in the way that you formulate the policy response, as our modern governments seem to do. They don't want to seem to actually devolve any real responsibility in the sense of mobilizing, for example, in the health service.
Yes, I think in Britain in particular, we're very centralized in our administrative procedures. That the NHS is the most centralized system in the world, which is both a vice and a virtue, depending on the particular problem you're confronting. But we will see the limits of rhetoric. We'll see that rhetoric only goes so far. Although war conversations can bring a nation together, the actual events that a government then has to confront have their own reality, which cannot be gainsaid by good rhetoric. And notably, Churchill lost the 1945 election despite being the war hero. In this instance, we're going to find an economic disaster unfolding after lockdown is released, and the government will have to deal with that. And no matter how good your war rhetoric has been in the interim, that the actual brute reality of what then confronts you is incredibly hard to deal with. So wars have their aftermaths as well, and winning the peace is very, very difficult. And I think the government's going to find that it's not having a particularly good war as it happens in the actual conduct of its policy in Britain, but it's going to find the aftermath of war even more difficult, I think.
Margaret, can I just bring you in there, just following up on what Philip said? In terms of an eminent historian like yourself, whether it's the economic aftermath that Philip was just talking about, the Great Depression in the case of the 1920s and 30s, or whether it's the actual conduct of a strategy in these very difficult circumstances, people invoking these blitz comparisons, do you think you should be sort of raising a hand and saying, look, it's nothing like the blitz, or I mean, do you see that you should become involved in these debates, or is it better to leave it on the political contemporary scale?
Well, I think historians should be involved, but whether anybody wants to listen to us is another matter, of course. But I think history is used so often in the rhetoric that politicians used, and the examples from history are used so often in trying to make policy, that I think it is actually very useful to understand that a lot about the past is very complicated, that the choices they were making were complicated, that yes, they made mistakes, but they also had things that they did right. They had constraints on them. And I think that might help us to think through some of the things we're going to have to deal with. I mean, I think it's very clear that after the First World War, when government spending suddenly stopped, there was a depression, not the Great Depression, there was a depression immediately after 1918. And governments learned something from that, that you can't suddenly cut back on government spending when you've been spending a lot. You have to think about how you're going to do it. And so I do think it's important to look back at historical examples, if only to raise the sort of questions we should be asking now. And I think the other thing I think that's very important about the end of wars is how political and other leaders can manage public expectations. I mean, you make a great effort to get through a particular crisis, the pandemic or a war, and somehow you need to think about what's going to happen next. I mean, there's, I think, an expectation too often that we'll win this one and then everything's going to be okay. The bluebirds will sing and the sun will shine and we'll all go out and have picnics and it's all going to be like it was. And that's where I think we really need good political planning and leadership. What do we do next? I mean, we are not going to win a war against this virus. And people are warning, scientists who know much more than I do, are warning that it may be with us for some time to come. There's no surety there's going to be a vaccine, that it's suddenly going to disappear. And so how do we deal with that? How do we keep the best of what we've learned from this? And how do we continue to manage it so that we come out of it? And how do we deal with the economic fallout? I mean, we're beginning to talk about that, but the effects are going to be with us for a very long time indeed. And I think that's something we need to be thinking about. And I think publics have to expect that it's not going to be all right away.
I'm going to move on to our sort of second main section of discussion in a moment, which is really about government communication. But before we do that, Philip, just a quick thought from you. Do you think that a great national trial like this, if we look, for example, at the evidence of the 20th century, produces a move to the left politically, as it did with the election of Attlee or in the 20s?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it sometimes does, but we've had other crises, not wars, but other crises, such as the financial crisis, where a move to the left was prophesied in many places and didn't come about. There is something about a collective endeavour, which obviously is conducive to the rhetoric and intellectual thought of the left. So there are people on the left who think this is likely to be the case, but I don't think necessarily it is necessarily the case. It may well be, though, that the aftermath of the virus itself and the economic problems which ensue then lead to the ejection of the sitting government. So I think what tends to happen is that the incumbent government struggles with the consequences of the war or the virus and is then ejected. That tends to be what happens, rather than there to be a general shift from one side to the other. So it may well be that the punishment that ensues for sitting governments is a result of the fact that they were there in situ when the disaster struck. That tends to be what happens, I think.
Right. So let's now talk about the messaging, the language. Do you, well, let's open the question. How do you think, Philip, the government language and rhetoric in this crisis compares to that in previous ones? What are the interesting comparisons and differences?
Well, I think they've been very confused. I think it's been quite difficult to follow their messages. I think they've struggled quite badly to formulate a central question. When it was at the beginning, they were quite straightforward and simple: stay at home, and that was a very clear message. And I think they've found it very difficult to put nuance into that. And as you come out of a lockdown, I think they've found it hard to find simple, clear ways to communicate. So I think the government have struggled quite badly with this. It's something that none of them will have had experience of before. And to this extent, the virus we're demonstrating it's not really like a war, where a certain amount of war rhetoric can be extremely clear. I mean, let's go back right to the beginning of rhetoric, really the first democratic speech that we know of, Pericles' funeral oration, where he's talking about the Peloponnesian War. It's a very complex speech, but at heart it's also very simple. And you can have really simple, clear messages when your essential message is we are the virtuous ones and they, the invaders or our assailants, are the bad guys. And that is, you've got a clear audience that you're talking to, and that's a very clear message. With a virus, it's much more difficult and much more complex, and you're asking people to do particular things. So you're not just doing a speech like Lloyd George might have been in the First World War, or Churchill, where one of your functions is inspirational, just to keep going. You've got to, in the rhetoric of a virus, communicate real hard information, which leads to actual action on the part of millions of citizens. And that is a really intrinsically very difficult rhetorical task.
Margaret, if you were invited to Chequers for a great brainstorming session about what the national message should be now, and forming it with your own sense of history, what advice would you give?
I think the first advice I'd give is to say, talk to us like grown-ups. You know, don't show us pretty pictures. I thought the Prime Minister's talk when he came back from having the virus himself, when he showed pretty flip charts, was a mistake. I thought, you know, we're grown-ups. Tell us that it's complicated. Tell us it's not going to be easy. And I think, you know, Philip's absolutely right. This is different from a war. I mean, it's not just about inspiring people. It's asking individuals to take responsibility. I mean, essentially what the government is doing is saying to all of us, look, you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to be careful. We are relying on you to do this. And that seems to me that message has not come through very clearly, perhaps because there has been such a stress on messaging in politics recently that I think you get too much focus among politicians on the message being the most important thing. Sometimes it's the way the message is delivered. And I think this is where people like Angela Merkel have been very successful, and Jacinda Ardern have talked very directly and said to people, this is complicated, but this is why we're asking you to do what we're asking you.
I agree with that. I think one of the things that we've lost in political messages over the last 30 years or so is the ability to express any doubt. Politics has become an arena of fake certainty, and politicians always like to sound incredibly sure and certain. And that's never really true. You can never really be that certain. And you certainly can't at the moment, when both the political and the scientific basis of this are disputed and difficult. And the inability of politicians in Britain, and I agree with the examples where they've been able to do it, to express any reasonable doubt, whilst also retaining authority as a leader, has been a very marked aspect of this crisis. I think in New Zealand, the Prime Minister has been able to do that, and Angela Merkel has done so, where expressing doubt does not lead you to think worse of them as a leader. On the contrary, you think they're displaying more authority precisely because they're acknowledging the fact that there is doubt in the facts. And I don't think in British rhetorical culture we're anywhere close to getting that right. I think we have this phony certainty and the appeal to the science from the beginning, as though the science were a singular thing, has been the evidence of that.
Philip, though, once again, if I put you at this hypothetical Chequers summit or brainstorm, you wouldn't tell the Prime Minister to promise the public blood, sweat, and doubt. I mean, what would your key points be if he wanted to make a speech, you know, turning the page on the first phase of this and moving now into this less certain time?
Well, I mean, the next phase will be releasing lockdown further, I suppose. I think the only message that he's given, which actually would be applicable to this next phase, and here again I'm agreeing with Margaret, is to suggest to the public that ultimately they have to take control. When Boris Johnson said that we should use our common sense, he was quite widely mocked for saying that. And everybody said that's very vague, that doesn't mean anything. I thought the opposite. I thought that was the only moment where he was starting to ask people to say, you understand the basis of my remarks, you understand what I'm trying to say to you, just go out there and observe the spirit of these remarks. We cannot capture everything in the letter of any law, so observe the spirit of these remarks, use your common sense. And I know that is unusual. I know that sounds as though it's not pinning down exactly what everybody should do in every instance, but I don't think you can. And so I would actually be advising him to go back to that, to appealing to people to be intelligent and wise as they know what is the right thing to do.
Margaret, we do though seem to like as a kind of noisy, querulous Anglo-Saxon public to sort of have our cake and eat it in this sense, don't we? To both expect really specific advice and expect to take an awful lot of these decisions ourselves, informed by our own sense of what's right and wrong.
Well, yeah, look, I mean, we're human beings, and I would include Canadians among the querulous publics as well. And, you know, we want what is not always reasonable. And I think that's where our leaders have to say to us, look, we can do so much for you, but you're going to have to do things for yourselves. And I think people understand it. I mean, it is so noticeable that in countries such as the UK, people were beginning to isolate themselves before the government asked them to do it. And there's been very little grumbling about it. You know, I think the government, again, perhaps didn't trust people enough. I think there was a fear that if you lock people down too soon, they'd run amok and they'd be out in the streets rioting and having parties at close quarters. And in fact, there were very, very few incidences of that. So I think the government has underestimated people. And of course we'll grumble. I mean, that's what we do. It's you know, something we grumble about our governments. But on the whole, we understand that they're actually trying to do things that make sense. So we hope they are.
We've not got a huge amount of time left. Maybe just to focus in this last few minutes on the personality of Boris Johnson as a leader and dare one say it, how history may judge him. I mean, clearly the fact that he had coronavirus so badly created all sorts of, well, sympathy, of course, and political possibilities for him. And I just wonder how each of you view the fact that a leader came so close to dying here in terms of informing this, and indeed even the language, you know, once again, people saying, oh, he's a fighter, things like that, resorting to the language of struggle and war. Where does it leave him, do you think, Philip?
I've been surprised at how little that he has used that in his subsequent communication. Now, there's always a difficulty here because you don't want to be cynical about it. I mean, this is a serious illness, and it's not just a recipe for messages later. But nevertheless, it did happen to him. He is the leader. He has got some personal experience of it, and yet he's carrying on as if it hasn't happened. It's barely been mentioned. So I would have been inclined to have use that as part of the way of communicating with people. So I understand this because I've been through it. It's something as a writer or a politician, you're always wondering the extent to which you plunder the autobiography and the recent events to make political capital. And part of you doesn't want to do it because it sounds extraordinarily cynical, put like that. But nevertheless, it is your life, it is your experience, and it is pertinent. So I've been surprised he hasn't used that. And I would have advised him to do so a bit, to draw on it, to talk in a more sympathetic way, to get an emotional connection with people because of the experience he's gone through. And he hasn't really done that. And I think that would open up the opportunity for him to do something which I think he ought to do, which is to start to admit some errors. I think the government have made mistakes, and I think the pretense that they haven't, which they're still going through, doesn't do them any good. I think, again, paradoxically, you increase your authority if you concede a little bit. And at the moment, there's no concession at all in government communication, and I think that would help as well. They would regain some credibility with us, with the audience, I think, by conceding that things have obviously not gone as well as we might have hoped they would.
Margaret, do follow up on that, but can I also just load in one other thought, final thought maybe, which is, of course, Winston Churchill, Boris Johnson's great hero, a man with a quite considerable experience of war and the front line before 1939. Did he refer back to it often in his wartime communication with the British public, or was he tempted to put that into the background too?
Well, he didn't dwell on his many mistakes, although he did survive them, which I think is something. And I think he did use his own military experience. I think the difference with this government is that they came into office with a leader and with a program that was very confident. We're going to get Brexit done. And Boris Johnson is the sort of personality, only I'm saying this and not having met him, but from watching him, who likes to be very positive. You know, he's always very positive. What ho, let's get on with it. You know, we're going to get Brexit done. We have an oven ready thing. It's all going to happen. And so suddenly to turn around and say, actually, we're not sure and we don't know what the answer is to a very different sort of challenge would, I think, be more difficult than it might be for other governments. I mean, Churchill had failures which he dealt with, Gallipoli, for example, other failures in his life. And I think he was more used to moving on, admitting them. And I think, again, speaking as a member of the public, I would appreciate a leader who said, look, we made a mistake. We're going to see what we can do to sort it out, rather than tell me when I can see for myself that their reaction hasn't always, and their response hasn't always been that good.
Philip, the last thought?
Well, I think that's where political rhetoric ought to go in the future, to treat the informed public as more intelligent than politicians currently do. We're just coming at the very end of a period of really tight messaging and control in political rhetoric, and I think the time has run out on it. I don't think it works anymore. I think it does not lead to an enhancing of your authority. So I think the future will be for that leader who can communicate in a way which demonstrates doubt, demonstrates fallibility, whilst at the same time exuding authority. And I don't think those things are incompatible. I'm not sure Boris Johnson is that leader. I think he has proved to be a very good electoral asset for the Conservative Party and very good at some aspects of politics. But the most difficult parts of politics are the slow grind of administration and getting things done. And that's what this war, if we're going to call it that, is all about. And I don't think his virtues are well suited to this. And I think that underneath every communication problem, there's always an actual problem underneath it. And this is the case here. We're seeing the difficulties of message are in fact telling you that there's something very difficult in the conduct of this war. That's what they're struggling with. It's not just the words on the top.
Closing thought, Margaret?
No, I agree completely. I do think perhaps we've run out of messaging. And I think, you know, you're seeing it in the United States with a president who has said with great conviction things that are absolutely contradictory from one day to the next. And it's beginning to affect even his base, who have tended to believe implicitly everything he said. And I think that you gain authority, in fact, when you're able to say that you've got it wrong. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I think was a great president, did actually go on the radio and say, no, we've made some mistakes, but we're going to do our best. And I think that's what we expect from our politicians. And I very much hope Philip is right, that we're going to see a shift in the sort of rhetoric we get and the sort of leadership we get.
Margaret and Philip, thank you both very much indeed for such an illuminating discussion. And this, of course, is the first of several. In the meantime, the doors of the Imperial War Museum will reopen as soon as we can possibly do that and as soon as the regulations allow. But you can donate to the museum if you feel able to do that, if you can afford to. It's at www.iwm.org.uk/support. Our next discussion, our next video, will be about the post-pandemic world order and what history tells us about that. Thank you all very much for joining us.